So Andrew, for today at least, you're going to be sort of our Catholic authority.
Cool.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Talk about your experience and education and how best to sort of understand you in the grand world of Catholicism.
Yeah. So I grew up with a Catholic father and a Protestant mother. Went mostly to Protestant church. And then it was really in high school when I started going to a Catholic high school that came more into my life. Jacob and I actually went to the same school together. So that's how we first met. Fun fact.
Backstory.
How we first met. It's there's an even older story there. Andrew.
Actually, I guess that wasn't our first meeting, but that was when we got to know each other, was going to that Catholic high school. But we met way back as wee little grade 6 kids. So yeah, that's a story for a different day.
Deep history. Good that we have the character development already on board.
Yeah. After Catholic high school, I went to a Catholic university up in the Pacific Northwest, and that was where I formally joined the Catholic Church. Was during my freshman year there, and I've been formally part of the Catholic Church since then. I am now a divinity student studying for my Master's of Divinity. I'm in my first year at Duke Divinity School here in Durham, North Carolina.
Now, Master's of Divinity, is that required for the priesthood?
So, yes. I am not going for the priesthood. I'm going for other forms of ministry, which is the same degree. The priesthood generally requires more seminary in addition to that. But Master's of Divinity is the base degree. Also, if you're going to become a priest in a Catholic church, you would go to a Catholic divinity school. Duke is a predominantly Methodist Protestant seminary and divinity school. So it's a little bit of a different situation, but I'm interested in doing hospital ministry. So I wanted a more diverse ecumenical Christian background to go into that for my divinity school years. But yeah, so I've been formally a Catholic for, 5 years now, 6 years, going on 6 years. Yeah. And, but I've been a part of the Catholic diaspora, or whatever you want to call it, since freshman year of high school back in 2012. So about a decade now. And obviously I have ties that go back even further than that.
So you are a Catholic convert. So if anyone in our audience now or listening later on has a perspective from someone who was born within Catholicism, feel free to share that or raise your hand, and we'll be interested to hear what you have to say. I realized that I didn't actually introduce myself. Hello, my name is Broclen. I am the digital minister and a moderator for Dank Christian Memes. Jacob here is my better half on the moderation team, and as we heard, is our deep backstory connection to Andrew here, today's sort of Catholic authority. So I want to share a little bit about myself in this regard too, because I also have a mother who's Catholic and a father who was raised Lutheran. And I'd be curious to know what you think of this. A lot of people say that, you may leave the Catholic Church or whatever, either for another church or just for no church at all. But you are always a Catholic. Do you feel like that rings true for you as someone who came into the Catholic Church? Do you feel like it is forever a part of your identity now?
Yeah, I think so, because with the Catholic Church, kind of their view of it is once you're a part of it, it's like a family. Once you're a part of it, you can choose to walk away from that family, but it's still a part of you, and you can always come back to it. So I definitely feel you're permanently a part of the Catholic Church. You always have that membership, so to speak. Interestingly, I think in some ways I feel a little bit about my Presbyterian upbringing in the same way. I don't think quite as strongly, but there are definitely aspects of that upbringing that I still hold on to, even though I am a Catholic and I have some fundamental theological disagreements with the Presbyterian Church. So, once you're part of the Catholic Church, you're always a part of the Catholic Church, and it's really up to you to decide how a part of that church you want to be. But, I think a lot of people look at it within the church, look at it as kind of the prodigal son, where, if you ever are interested in coming back, we will welcome you with open arms back into that.
That's a nice way to think about it.
Yeah.
So, if, as moderators, and Jacob, feel free to chime in and disagree here. I feel like as moderators on Dang Christian Memes, we get kind of a mod's eye view of a lot of conversations and interactions that happen on the sub on Dang Christian Memes. And I don't mean to suggest that the mod's eye view is a perfect one. It is not. No point of view is perfect, except perhaps for God's. But we see that there's three groups that kind of catch a bit of flack on Dang Christian Memes. The first two I'm going to pair together: Jehovah's Witnesses and Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as Mormons, and there is a distinction there. And these two groups get a bit of trouble because they are on the smaller side, and there are some theological components to those belief structures that has some people questioning, to what extent is this a Christian theology? But we get a lot of jokes poked at them, but we also get quite a few jokes poked at Catholicism. And I feel like it's sort of the opposite, where Catholicism is sort of the big game in town. And I think there's a good number of folks out there who, when they think about Christianity, they think Catholicism. So the first one I want to bring up that's sort of been messed around is images. I think a lot of people struggle with the Virgin Mary and images of the Virgin Mary showed in various places. And I think folks struggle with the difference between, praying to or praying with. And I know that's called intercession, but I'm probably not the right person. Can you talk about intercession a little bit and how Catholic worship sort of involves these images in a somewhat unique fashion?
Yeah. So I'll start with intercession, intercessory prayer, because I think that's the more straightforward of the two.
Is it okay to call it praying with? Because I feel like that's an easier way to think about it. But is it inaccurate?
That's how it was described to me, and that's how I describe it to other people. So you might, I think the classic example I've heard the most is, you might ask your mom to pray for you. You might ask Mary, Mother of God, to pray for you, because we have a certain motherly image of her. And that's really what it is. So the theology, in its kind of most simplistic form, states that the saints are the people that are currently in heaven with God in full, unhindered communion. So we are asking them to pray for us or talk to God on our behalf. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to pray. We pray directly to God as well. But it functions very similar to if you would ask a community of people here on earth to pray for you. So that is the basic theology. And if you look at the ways in which we word things in lectionaries and in the Roman Missal, which is the book that we use during liturgical services, that has
I recently learned that
sayings and
the Missal, it's called.
Yeah, the Roman Missal. So there's
which is not an air-to-air weapon. It is a book, even though it sounds like missile. It is not spelled that way.
Yes, although it is a very heavy book, so I think in a very dire, Walking Dead sort of situation, I think God would
Bible in
God
one
would
hand,
understand.
missile in the other. That's how you're going to go out.
So yeah, but anyway, so within those, you see, like in the Mass, there's a part where we confess our sin, and it talks about how we ask our brothers and sisters in Christ to pray to the Lord our God, and we ask the saints to pray on our behalf. So there's language of praying on our behalf. It's asking to pray. So you're not saying, dear Mary, in the way you would say, dear God or dear Jesus. So you're not speaking to Mary or any saint as an entity that has a kind of divinized power to control things. Because God, the triune God of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is just that. It's not any of the saints. However, in practice, sometimes this is not how things look. And I think that's also true of images as well. Because images are meant to give us, they're meant to be like a worship aid. There's something we can reflect on. There's something that adorns our churches. A lot of them came out of originally ways to tell the Bible for the illiterate, right? The point of a stained glass window originally was to tell stories from the Bible for people who couldn't read the Bible. So they're hearing them on Sunday,
which was most people at that time.
Which is most people. For most of history, that's most people. So you hear the gospel being proclaimed, you hear the scriptures being read during Mass, and you're seeing these images around the church that you can meditate on. However, there are ways in which those images do become idol-like. I think one really good example was a few years ago was the 100th anniversary of the apparition of Mary at Fatima, which Marian apparitions is a whole nother topic. We can get into at a later point.
Oh boy, I hadn't even thought of that. Yeah, that's a popular one.
There's a very specific statue that was created after that apparition from the description that these three little children gave of what Mary looked like. And that statue, if you see the way people pay homage to it, and especially if you see some of the video and some of the content that came out of that 100th anniversary, it looks similar in practice to religions where it's believed that certain images or certain statues are imbued with kind of the power of a deity. So,
yeah, I sometimes call this the difference between, the formalized theology that we might learn in seminary school and might be preached from the pulpit, and the sort of popular theology of how people, if not maybe what they believe, because people aren't always articulating exactly what they believe, but are participating in things from their own perspective that isn't 100% lined up with that formalized theology. Do you think that's partially, sort of responsible for that kind of difference?
I think so. I think in theory, we're asking the saints to come alongside us and pray for us. I think in certain contexts, the reality becomes us praying to the saints as if there's they're almost divinity. So, yeah, I think the popular practice theology sometimes can differ greatly from the doctrinal prescribed theology. And I think that's common. And I think it's now less common, at least I can only speak to an American context and my limited experience in the American Catholic Church. But I think it is less common, especially with younger generations. But I think with older generations, at least in the United States, some of those practices and reading some texts, some historic texts, there are definitely ways in which that was practiced, and that was a very common practice. And there are superstitions that have evolved around relics of saints, which I think falls into a similar category as the statues and the images, and around images and statues of, like it's kind of like how sometimes on college campuses, like a certain statue of a university founder or important figure, students will rub it before an exam for good luck. You see that same sort of thing happening with different things related to the saints in the Catholic Church. So, and it kind of, I think it can depend on what the use of that ritual is. I don't think that here at Duke, where I am, when students rub the statue of our founder, Washington Duke, during finals week for good luck, I don't think they're actually worshiping him or thinking that beyond the grave, he somehow is going to actually influence their final. But I do think there are people that think those sorts of rituals among the saints can have a certain impact. So And I think it can. I think there can be certain things, right? Like there's a concept that we have patron saints of certain things, certain saints that we ask certain types of prayers of. But I don't think that's the same as saying, well, if I do this specific act, through this saint, it'll somehow happen and be accomplished.
I want to
and I
throw
think
something
sometimes
out there,
people do it.
and I want you to disagree with it as you feel appropriate to disagree with it. Would you say that the Catholic Church, at least, you know, in sort of our American experience of it, is a little more focused on ritual as well as tradition, in a way that, you know, some other, you know, Christian denominations, you know, don't have that same focus?
Yes, I think so. I think so. There's liturgical churches and non-liturgical churches, meaning simply that there are prescribed rituals. So we have the book of the Roman Missal that prescribes how we do our rituals. The Anglican Episcopal churches in the United States and North America have the Book of Common Prayer. The United Methodist Church has their own book, and those have prescribed ways in which this is how you celebrate on Sunday, this is how you celebrate the Eucharist, this is how you perform weddings. So that's a liturgical church. In the most theological definition. Not that non-liturgical churches can't have aspects of that, but that's kind of what the definition of what it means to be a liturgical church. And even within that, there's high liturgy and low liturgy. And high liturgy is a lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of, you know, you think incense, you think a lot of times very intricate vestments, the Latin rite of the Roman Mass. So the kind of classic priest wearing that like funny garb that's all embroidered and carrying the incense and speaking in Latin, that would be considered high church. Whereas there's also low church, which is you still have those liturgical rites, but they're a little less fancy, a little less pomp and circumstance. That's more of the masses you'll see here in the United States. There's also generally a divide between, so the Latin or the extraordinary form is pretty much always high church. There are low church service or high church services that are in what's called the New Ordo or the Nova Ordo, which is the English version of the Mass. But most of the time you'll see a more low church version of that.
Even the English version of the Mass has a Latin title, doesn't it?
Yeah. And that's part
a little counterintuitive.
Latin is the official language of the church, and all Vatican documents are formally kept in Latin. So the kind of final version of every document is the Latin version.
Wow.
It's translated into the other languages, which is funny because a lot of them are written originally in Italian. But that's a whole different thing where most of the cardinals speak it. For the longest time, most cardinals spoke Italian. So that was their kind of go-to language. And then they would translate into Latin, and then from Latin translate into other languages.
I want to tell you about a story. And I'd like for you to help me sort of manage my sin in this situation. So I grew up in an area. I grew up Protestant, but the area I live is pretty Catholic. We've got a fair number of Italian Catholics, a fair number of Irish Catholics. Catholicism is quite a presence where I live. So when I was going to school, as a lot of people who went to public school, Friday afternoon was pizza day in the cafeteria. And one Friday I was enjoying my pizza, and it was a nice pepperoni pizza. And a couple girls across, the lunch table from me, they took issue and told me that because I was eating meat on a Friday, I was going to go to hell. And that was something I should really be concerned about. And I asked, who says that? And she said, well, the Pope. And then I very snootily shot back, well, I'm Protestant, and continued to scarf down my pepperoni pizza. How much of a sin is the pizza? Is it a bite for bite sin? Is it the entire slice sin? And if I wanted to make good on that, how much, what would that mean? For them, this seemed like a big deal. Do you think that's a big deal for other Catholics as well?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And you get that a lot about that and other practices that Catholics have that relate to kind of how you practice your Catholicism.
I was surprised that they felt so strongly about it, and equally surprised that, once I realized it was a Catholic thing, I was like, oh, well, I'm immune to that without without a second thought.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of it too is there's this idea that anytime you're not following and this isn't everyone, but some people are this way, and I think it's an idea that's changing. But there are among some Catholics this idea that anytime you don't follow a prescribed tradition of the church, that you are sinning. It's a very complex thing. There's also in the Catholic Church different levels of sin. There's mortal sin and venial sin, and basically it's kind of how much are you damaging your relationship with God.
So which one does the pizza count as? What's
so
the breakdown?
That would count as a venial sin, which is a lesser sin. So a mortal sin is described as something of a grave nature. You know it's wrong and you choose to do it anyway, and you have the free will to do it. So like a classic example of something that would not fulfill all of those would be anything involving addiction. So, because you don't have the free will, and granted, addiction, and that's a whole different.
Well, that's a really interesting theological perspective, which leaves room for mercy.
Yeah, and that's part of it. There is within that, and so with something like addiction, the general idea of the church would be that doing things that are harmful to your body in a way is a sin. So overuse of a particular substance. But you're not freely choosing, because you are suffering from addiction. You're not freely choosing to do that. So it's a lesser sin. And so mortal sins are things that are thought to be kind of completely break our relationship with God. And we have to go to reconciliation. We have to do work to repair that relationship. And God is always merciful. God always, reconciles with us. Whereas venial sins are maybe something that hurts a relationship, but doesn't break it. If you call your friend stupid, that's going to hurt your friendship. But that's a very different situation than if you were to do something that just made your friend completely distrust you, right? So that's kind of how it works in those ways. So back to the pizza thing, it would be a venial sin. You're not, to my understanding at least, you're not completely breaking your relationship with God by eating meat. And don't quote me on this because I haven't looked into it, but I don't actually know if the Catholic Church considers you not following that a sin for a few reasons.
Oh, right. So the original accusation may not have been valid. I hadn't considered that.
Yeah. And there's two reasons for that. One is that part of the post-Second Vatican Council, which was this council where all the bishops were gathered in the 1960s to kind of revise Catholic doctrine and practice, they got rid of the necessity to abstain from meat on all Fridays that were not during Lent. So theoretically, if this was a Friday in July, which is not during Lent, in 1998, for instance, or 2005, or 2010, or 1973, you would not be sinning.
So it's only a sin during Lent?
Yes.
Because that's part of a ritual tradition that you would then be sort of breaking.
If it is a sin to begin with. And I do not know if that is a sin, because just because something's a liturgical practice, or just because something is a kind of practice of the church, does not mean that not doing it is a sin. For instance, there's something called the Liturgy of the Hours, which is a set of prayers that one prays throughout the day. There's morning prayer, there's hourly prayer, which people really only do in the context of people who live in monasteries. But there's noonday prayer, and then there's evening prayer. A lot of people do morning prayer, noon prayer, and evening prayer, or one of those. People who are ordained ministers are called to do morning prayer, noon prayer, and evening prayer. So that's priests, deacons, and bishops. However, my understanding is that, as a Catholic, I am not sinning by not doing morning prayer and not doing midday prayer and not doing evening prayer, because it's a practice that's practiced in the church, but it's not a requirement of our faith, if that makes sense.
If I'm ever brought before, as a living person, because, of course, I'll be brought before the judge at the end. But I hadn't considered the charges against me might be erroneous, and that, instead of pleading nolo contendere, I should have maybe thought about it a little more before I shrugged it off. I want to go to the comments, because we do actually have some comments. Most of them are not real questions. One is, are Catholics the dankest of the Christians? I imagine most Catholics would tell you so.
It's true, Catholics would say that.
And if all Catholics said it and they have the majority, then they may sort of have us up against a corner on this one.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to another issue, though. Someone says something, and we hear this a lot in our comments on Dank Christian memes. Please tax them churches. I want to give my 2 cents on this as a Protestant, and then I'd love to hear the Catholic perspective on tax exemptions for Catholic churches. I'm of the mind that I understand that there are churches out there that are committing tax fraud. What I've seen is, just in my local area, keeping an eye on things, a lot of that tax fraud is property tax fraud, that the church owns properties and these properties are not being taxed, but it's unclear whether or not these properties are part of the life and mission of the church. So I want to acknowledge that it's an issue, at least in my area, that's worth looking into. I live in New England, the northeastern United States. Another thing I'm going to mention, I know a lot of people are caught up on tax exemptions based around whether or not they are political or tell their parishioners to vote for certain candidates. I think the law on that is pretty well settled, and there's plenty of gray area for churches to play with. But I think a lot of tax exemption is based off the presumption that churches are paying back into the community. And I think that a lot of people have rightly noticed that many churches can't actually do that for whatever reasons, and end up being more of a self-preservation organization or a museum on some level, and that they don't end up doing a lot of mission out in the community. So I would suggest that those churches who do contribute, do justice work for the poor, doing community uplift, that those churches should not be taxed. But churches that are unable to demonstrate that they do that should, perhaps be considered for an audit. However, I'm talking about small Protestant churches that are, in my case, my denomination, most denomination churches are actually independent themselves. They handle their own finances. They may not even pay dues to a denomination. The Catholic Church has a lot of property in a lot of different places. What kind of implications are there for losing tax exempt status for the Catholic Church and their properties?
Yeah. So there's a few things going on here. One is that in addition to being religious entities, they're also nonprofits. I'm no expert in nonprofit law, but I would assume that if you were to start taxing churches, that most churches would still be able to claim a nonprofit status, which would mean that, theoretically they could still avoid paying taxes. So that's
a very good point.
I'm not well versed in nonprofit law. I'm not well versed in church tax exemption, so I can't speak on it beyond. I'm sure there are ways to qualify. However, I do know nonprofits have very strict rules about political advocacy and what they can and can't say, what they can and can't do. So if they were to file as nonprofits, I know there would be very specific rules around that. That being said, I think that as religious entities and kind of this tax exempt status, For me, I think it's a general rule that should be followed, partly because I think of a lot of small churches do have, I think specifically of like world churches. And yes, a lot of their stuff goes into self-preservation, but they're not, I don't know, how do I want to phrase this? Like they're serving a small community essentially as a nonprofit, even if, it's a religious nonprofit, but they're serving it as a nonprofit, right? So in some ways I see it as they are serving the community. While it be a select few of the community, they are serving the community. And a lot of them, though, do also do other things. I know now there's a difference when it comes to something like a diocese. So the Archdiocese in New York, for instance, I was actually just looking this up the other day because in one of my classes, we were talking about the role of the church in politics. And the Archdiocese of New York is worth several $billion, and they manage a investment and property portfolio that is worth billions of dollars, several $billion. I forget the exact figure, but it was several billion. So I think that raises an interesting question. I know some dioceses separate the money from the actual functioning of the churches. So the diocesan entity functions as a church separately than the finances and the actual running of it. So, there might be like the diocesan corporation, so to speak, that manages the properties and the money of the diocese. And then, the bishop of that is on the board of it and he helps run it. But that's separate from him being the bishop managing the church in a spiritual and theological formational way. So I know many dioceses separate those two things out, or they hire some sort of firm to manage their wealth for them. So I think a lot of them, then because of that, they do have their money is managed by a nonprofit system of some sort.
And I think I've seen things like that in Protestant churches as well, where, especially when they're very active in the community, that it makes things easier and perhaps more transparent by separating the church from the nonprofit organization that the church spawned. The one that comes to mind is Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and their spinoff, Repairers of the Breach. So I imagine that, there's all varieties of Protestants, implying those in similar organizational strategies.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think of, and two, because of the Catholic Church, there's multiple levels, right? Your parish has a certain fund that takes care of the parish. The diocese has a certain level. Religious orders also manage their own money and their own funds and their own things. For example, the school that Jacob and I went to together, there's two separate entities. There's the Sisters of St. Mary's that runs the schools. That's a nonprofit group of nonprofit order of sisters, and they have a set of schools underneath them. And then there's the Sisters of St. Mary's Corporation, which is the wealth management company that they set up in order to manage their funds. They're worth quite a bit of money. Just for a little bit of background, for those of you that may know this small athletic company called Nike, it's in our neck of the woods, and
Small athletic company.
Yeah. It started just down the street from our school, and their world headquarters is just a little bit further down the street. And all of that land once used to be owned by the Sisters of St. Mary's. So over the years, they've made a pretty penny selling off about a solid chunk of our hometown.
They still own a lot of it and rent it out too.
Yeah, so it sits
Talk about a controlling interest.
Yeah, it sits on a main intersection, and they own all four corners of that intersection. They're on one corner. One corner, they just built a brand new apartment complex. Another corner, they built like a coffee shop and a Carl's Jr. and a couple other things. And then one corner is a Toyota dealership. And they own all of that land. They don't own the businesses on top of it, but they own the land. So they have the Sisters of St. Mary's Corporation that runs all of that and manages that, and then makes financial contributions, donations to the school to help offset the cost of the school. So I know a lot of churches work that way, and some, I will admit, some do it for tax evasion purposes, because you can evade taxes that way, you can hide money that way. But I would say most, at least in the Catholic community, if for no other reason than there's always someone you're held accountable to, whether it be brother bishops who are going to shame you as a bishop, or they're, or the Pope, or, your bishop within the diocese that you work in that's going to be, have a vested interest in you keeping things above board. So some of them just do it for the simple fact that it's a lot simpler to untangle your money from your ministry. But I do understand when you look at especially some of these large organizations, supposedly Christian organizations, where there's an exuberant amount of wealth, and that wealth doesn't seem to always go to the community that you want to tax that. One of my particular academic areas of interest is something called the prosperity gospel. And it kind of is built off this concept of, if you're a good Christian, God loves you, good things will come to you. And that's where you get the mega churches with the mega pastors with the private jets. And that's a very common place for those sorts of things to happen. You might look at someone like Joel Osteen and say, does that man really need to be paid millions of dollars a year to be a pastor? So I can understand why, when you look at situations like that, people would be wanting the churches to be taxed. I think it's a nuanced debate. And I think it's definitely, I think if we had a practice in this country of religious organizations disentangling their money from their ministry, it would make things a lot simpler. But I do think, I understand the frustration with that, though.
Perhaps sometime I'll have to find some tax professionals or lawyers and see if we can dig deeper into the questions of tax exemptions around churches and what qualifies as breaking the rules in various circumstances. I want to try to spread things around here. So we have two people on stage. I want to give them an opportunity to ask questions or throw in their 2 cents. And then there's a couple comments, but if you want to leave a comment question, I will do my best to get to that. I am duty bound to not lose track of the comments, or I will be chastised rightfully. So I'm going to throw it to the last 2 brain cells. Do you want to ask a question, or did you have something to add?
I wanted to add on the meat debate on Friday. Sorry if you don't understand me.
My pizza problem. Yes, I ate pizza with meat on it during Lent.
During Lent, it's not something that's encouraged. But the thing is, those dietary laws are kind of against the Gospels. What is said in the New Testament, that the sin does not come through the mouth, but through the heart. Do you follow me?
Yeah. I honestly forgotten about that there was, is it in the book of Acts where Christ sort of says that from a cloud?
I think it's the Gospel of Matthew. I am not sure. I think it's the Gospel of Matthew.
I do think it's Acts, actually, if I remember right. Maybe we're thinking of 2 different passages, but there's a passage where...
probably we're thinking about different passages. But I remember reading the Gospel. But anyways, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. My point here is, it's more about the things that would make God content with you, to make God feel closer to you, if you know what I mean, to please Him.
Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. Also, if I'm brought up on this as an official charge, I'll add you to my defense team, because I had, completely spaced on that piece of scripture. So I should, think more seriously about my defense when I'm called out on sinful behaviors. The last profile, did you have a question or something you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, definitely. Just want to say thank you from Australia. So thank you for involving me in the conversation. It's just the last topic that we were talking about like the church being involved in like taxes and stuff like that. I think it's not really about like how the church raises its revenue rather than like the separation of church and state. Obviously, in Australia, the high school level that I've learned at particularly has talked about that separation of church and state. And I think like even as a Catholic, that's something that's really important. However, obviously like raising revenue and stuff like that, I'm not sure how it really is in the US, but in Australia, obviously, like you can leave like your will, like you can bequeath the church with like estate and stuff like that, and leaving that to the church is how it like generates revenue. But I think something that the Secrets Know mentioned in the comments, he said, if you're a non-profit, as long as you don't do politics, I think one really important factor to recognize is that like obviously as Christians ourselves, we do have the right to vote and all of that sort of thing. So if we do agree with a certain side or something like that, whether it's liberal or conservative, we do have the right to vote. And then just going ahead with that sort of thing and just like sort of agreeing with that, even if we do dabble in politics, I guess here and there, it's like sort of becoming from like our beliefs, if that makes sense. If that's something that like we want to touch on.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, so we've talked about churches and whether or not they should have tax exemptions, and are they, separating church and state enough to qualify. But there's also, and this is obviously a fictional myth, but in the story of Robin Hood, I believe Prince John was, or King John was taxing the church. And I don't know if that was one of the restrictions. Is there anything about taxing the church in the Magna Carta, Jacob? Do you remember that? I don't remember the term.
I have no idea on that front.
Well, I know that taxing churches and seizing property from churches has been a big political move over the years, especially during times of Protestant Reformation and so forth.
That's just what you do as a king when you're in economic crisis.
Also that.
Like multiple times. Henry VIII did it. I think William the Conqueror did it to an extent, if I remember right. He took over.
It's a messy history.
And stuff. Yeah, it happens like whenever the state is needing money.
All right, I'm gonna rotate some folks off stage. I'm gonna rotate some folks on stage, but I have a question, and I want to give Andrew the first shot at answering this one from the Catholic perspective. Can you help me understand the Father, Son, Holy Ghost, Spirit concept? Are they one or separate? Now, that sounds like a request for an explanation of the Trinity. Are you up for it, Andrew?
Yeah, I can try that.
All right, and I'm going to rotate folks while you answer this question.
Yeah, so funny enough, we actually, in my church history class, have been talking about this for the last week and a half, and the development of the doctrine of the Trinity and the various controversies and heresies that go along with it. So it's very complex. And there's some great people you can read on it. The Eastern Church Fathers are really great on it. A lot of them were involved in the debate and the refining of that. But essentially how it works, in the most basic sense, is we have one God. And that's something we inherit from Judaism. So now we have to make sense of this Jesus who claims to be God, and then this Spirit that descends upon the apostles at Pentecost. And how does God exist in essentially three different entities while being one entity? So there's a few. So first we talk about God in three persons. Persons essentially being three sections that are distinct and separate, but also unified. And there's there's a lot of analogies for this. They all break down at some point. And as my professor said yesterday when we were discussing this, if you talk about any of these analogies too long, you'll eventually just sound like a heretic, because it's complex and it's complicated, and there's a lot of logic and a lot of reasoning and a lot of thought that goes into it. But basically how it works was, so one of the big controversies or ideas was this concept that called modalism, which was that God starts as God the Father, God of Abraham in the Old Testament, Mount Sinai, then comes down and basically puts on almost like the costume of a human, and then as is on earth, and then goes back up into heaven, and then comes back down as the Holy Spirit. Now, the early church fathers and mothers, mostly fathers, because patriarchal society, but there are also some women who wrote on this and taught some of the church fathers. So I want to give them credit too, where it's due. But they early on saw an issue with this because you have examples of Jesus talking about the Father is like the big one, or and him praying to the Father and not my will but thy will, and like how does that work? If so, early on that was kind of denied as a heresy, this concept of modalism. So somehow we have three separate chunks, persons, that all coexist and have all existed for all of eternity. And there's some ways in which we get to that, because we can't have and part of it is a lot of it centers around Christ, and if Christ is a creature, if Christ is part of creation, if Christ is, and if he's a creature, then he can't be God, and there's all these different...
The hypostatic union itself is also very, very challenging, and we can go back and forth.
We eventually get to the hypostatic union, which is this concept of that Jesus is fully God and fully human, always. However, there's this idea that comes about that the Father begets the Son, and it comes from this concept of, so Christ is the Logos, which is the Word, and that's talked about in the Gospel of John, and that plays a very central word, like what is the Word? So they later define that as Christ, but they first start with basically, what is this entity of the Word? And if you look in John, at the beginning, it says the Word was God and the Word was with God, and there's some discrepancy in the translation. You really have to dig into the Greek if you want to get real technical about it. But there's this idea that, okay, so God the Father begets the Son, the Logos, but this has to essentially happen outside of time. So what they come to eventually is that the Father is permanently begetting the Son, and that they are one in substance. And there's this whole debate about how and which ways is Christ God. And so they essentially say they're of the same substance, homoousis. And there's all these like nuanced debates as to what that means, but the kind of big takeaway is that they're in one substance. And so eventually most of the church gets on board with that. And that's actually part of what the main issue of the Council of Nicaea.
Have you seen the St. Patrick's YouTube video of St. Patrick's bad Trinity analogies?
I have, yeah. And that, I think, gets at eventually all analogies on the Trinity break down and sound heretical. Because on the surface level, maybe they sound good for a second. Like the Shamrock one for a second sounds good, but it breaks down. They all break down eventually.
And I want to move on to... I'm sorry, I want to finish up what you're saying, and then I have to make sure I don't lose track. There's questions from far back that I've forgotten, so I have a guilt complex here, but finish your thought, sorry.
And so basically eventually what we get to is, and this is a much later thing, it's a little kind of like the main legwork is the Father and the Son relationship, is eventually that the Holy Spirit is also a part of this. And there is discrepancy at first about how that all relates. So the theology essentially heavily implies, without properly naming, that the Spirit also shares in that same substance or in that same being, while being three separate persons. So, yeah, it's very complicated. Basil and, both Basils and the Gregories are really great on this. Augustine's De Trinitate is great on this if you want to really dive into it. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks for pointing us towards the sources. So, I try to be dutiful to the comments, but a couple have slipped through the cracks. So, Andrew, I hope you'll help me do a little catch up here. I have two questions And when I say I have, I mean I'm looking for. There it is. As a Protestant, can I ask a Catholic priest to visit my mom in the hospital at a Catholic hospital?
Yes, the answer is yes. So that's actually part of what I want to go into is hospital ministry. And as Catholic chaplains, we're trained not just to be priest or layperson. We're trained not just to be for the Catholics. We're for everyone. So you can definitely, if you have a Catholic priest that you have a relationship with that you think might be a good person for your mom to talk to, you are more than welcome to have them, ask them to visit your mom. There is nothing saying that they can't, they can minister to your mom too. So, yeah.
Great. Okay. So let's move on to the next question, which, I don't know if it'll be complicated. It says, do you all believe in evolution? I'm curious about your thoughts on the new James Webb Space Telescope and images it's capturing. So I think the issue of evolution and Space Telescope images are a little bit separated, but what's your response before I give mine?
Yeah. So the Catholic Church formally states that there is no conflict between science and religion. You can thank Pope Leo XIII for that. Super great guy, super cool guy. And the theology essentially boils down to that science is something that looks at and observes and draws conclusions about our imminent finite world that we experience. And God both exists in that and exists outside of that. So yes, we do believe in evolution. And we believe in what science tells us about the nature of reality as we see it. But we believe there's a transcendent dimension. Where this gets kind of, I think a lot of the conflict comes, at least in theological debates in the United States, is how do we interpret things like Genesis? How do we interpret parts of the Bible that seem, the histories of which or the accounts of which seem to contradict what science tells us? And the simple answer within the Catholic Church is that not all scripture is meant to be taken literally. There's a truth being communicated by the authors that God is communicating to them. And it's communicated in such a way that that truth will always be there, no matter what the substrate of the text is. So something like Genesis, for instance, and also there's debates about if it should be taken literally or figuratively. They go back to even Jewish scholars. And when you look at the Hebrew, there's some really interesting things that point to it. It's probably allegorical. And so it's been interpreted that way for a while. When you look at something like that, the kind of way the Catholic Church views it is that through the story of creation in the 7 days, you get this allegory that communicates the truth that God is the creator of all things, and that God created humanity in God's image, and those conclusions that we draw from it. And so kind of the way that Catholic scientists and kind of the union of theology and science have come to be is that they're through these natural processes we can observe, like evolution. That's the short answer. There's a lot of really great Catholic scientists out there and philosophers who talk about this if you want to read it in more detail. You can also look at Dei Verbum, which is the Catholic Church's apostolic constitution on scripture that talks about how do we read and interpret scripture. I can't remember the name of the encyclical at the moment, but there's an encyclical which is basically a papal letter, a letter from the Pope by Pope Leo, where he talks about that. And then there's some great, interesting philosophers and scientists like Desjardins who talk about these things as well.
Yeah, you have different points of authority, but I think our traditions line up on this, that we can coexist in a world where we both have faith and value science, and that those aren't necessarily in conflict, although there are in America some religious groups who insist they are. And I think a lot of people then presume that of all Christians, because that tends to be a pretty vocal set of folks. The only thing I want to add is that things like the James Webb Telescope give us an opportunity to see God's creation in a way we never have before. So in my view, like things like the James Webb Telescope are pretty fantastic. The images are gorgeous, and it's a unique view of God's creation upon many unique views that science has offered us from microscope to telescope. I'll also point out I like the James Webb Telescope images so much that the cosmic cliffs image is actually part of the theme on Dang Christian Memes. So that's my view on it. Jacob, did you want to add anything about the space between science and religion as our resident archaeologist?
I guess I'll say that I have a personal story here, because I was actually raised young Earth creationist and was pretty
right. You mentioned that.
staunch about it for a long time, but that doesn't really work when you like get into archaeology. It just becomes so obviously wrong, to be frank, whenever you like interface with actual ancient materials. And so like I think the difficult part for a lot of people is to realize that like you basically you have to sometimes challenge your own preconceptions about the world when you like try to add science into religion, and vice versa, because often the cultural built up paradigms we have are not taking into account newer methodologies and whatnot, and that's fine. If your exact interpretation of the Bible is challenged by an artifact, it shouldn't, assuming your faith is healthy, make you an atheist overnight anyway.
No single archaeological dig should be shaking your faith to the core, and if it does, your faith may have been a little wobbly in the first place. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, honestly. I think that I personally, from my experience in young Earth creationism, think that YEC culture in the United States is characterized by insecurity rather than security, because it's usually playing the defensive rather than...
It's just such a weird hill to die on. Of all the important things that are in the Bible, why are we stuck on the first 2 chapters of Genesis? Yes.
I don't know. It's just the state of the culture right now, I guess.
Well, I want to give Who Silver 19 an opportunity. You've been very patient. I'm sorry to make you wait so long. Did you have a question or something you wanted to add into the conversation?
Oh yes, I definitely did wanted to. I do a podcast, a weekly podcast called "Peace Be With You," and it's something that I've been exploring myself. But as referring back to the meat thing, Matthew 15 is where
pizza.
The pizza thing. Matthew 15 is a big thing that talks about, where Jesus talks about and says it's not from what food you take in, because it goes out of the body. It's what you say from the heart that comes out of the mouth.
So perhaps the bigger problem is not so much that I ate this, as some see it, sinful pizza, but perhaps the curt attitude with which I treated my accusers is the real sin for which I need redemption.
Correct. As I understand, gluttony being as a sin, having too much of that food. And I'm not saying that you're gluttonous or I'm accusing you of any
public
kind of
school
sin.
portion. It was a regulated portion. I had no choice in how much it was.
Yeah, and in my fact, I believe that no, it's not sinful. As a Protestant, as I've said before, I do not believe it is sinful.
I think the biggest lesson of the pizza is that we need more theological thought experiments. So the sinful pizza during Lent is the thought experiment of this episode. Thank you to everyone who participated in that. I wanted to.
I will just
go
one
ahead.
other thing on the pizza bit, and that verse and what we're discussing is part of why I questioned if it actually is a sin. But the original reason for the practice was that when you think of the early church and the Mediterranean diet, and this is also why there's an exception for fish, meat is an expensive product. Poultry and pork, and which is a new thing for the church for Christians to be able to eat, but pork and beef, these are expensive products. So the idea was that one would forego a portion of meat on Friday and collect that money and give that money to help feed the poor. So the intention behind it originally was both a certain level of giving something up, being unified with Christ and suffering, and that's why we still practice it during Lent, but also as part of giving to the poor. So like if you read the documentation in which they stop making this a practice in the Catholic Church, they say essentially that in replacement of no longer practicing this, we should as Catholics intentionally take time to work for those who are less fortunate. So
that's very consistent
that's an important part of it too, is what was the intention behind the practice, and how does that play into the way in which we live our lives?
On the Protestant side of things, during Lent, we often say that we don't give things up for Lent; we take things up for Lent, and that's while that sacrificial component can be valuable, that taking things up for the sake of the community is perhaps more important. All right, so I have a couple more questions and comments. Are we good for a couple more questions? We're coming up on our target time here.
I'm good to do some more.
All right, so let's start with what books or media, podcast, YouTubes, do you recommend for anyone looking to learn more about modern theology, parentheses, not just Augustine or Aquinas?
Yeah, I think, and this is, I think, kind of the go-to for most Catholics, Bishop Robert Barron, who was actually just elevated to a new diocese, but he started what's called Word on Fire, and he has a whole series of YouTube videos, and he's a brilliant theologian, very well-versed in Catholic theology. He's really good at explaining both Catholic theology and kind of modern theology as a whole. I think he's definitely a good resource. His videos are interesting and accessible. And a lot of what his Word on Fire group does is very kind of geared toward younger Catholics and the kind of tech-savvy generation. So I think, especially if you're interested in learning kind of modern Catholic thought, it's a great place to go. I think, too, you have people like, so I want to include some other non-Catholic sources here. Bart is a great one. He is I want to say Belgian Lutheran.
Karl Barth, for those who don't know.
Yeah, Karl Barth. He's come up a lot in the last couple of weeks in my theology classes. And
he won't stop coming up.
Yeah, he's a pretty prominent figure in modern Protestant theology. And he does some interfacing too with Catholic theology, from what I understand. So he's definitely a good person to look into in his works. I'm going to give a little note, though.
Bart is not easy, especially when you're working with the English translation. I think that Bart is a lot more precise, and that, in English we can struggle with his concepts like freedom. So definitely do read Karl Barth, but just know, be prepared. It's not an easy walk.
Yeah, I was going to say, Karl Barth is a 20th century European academic. So he reads like a 20th century European academic. So, but there's also plenty of people that came out of his kind of school of thought that are easier to read. So he's a good one. Not to just like totally promote my own professors, but also to totally promote my own professors.
At least you're honest.
At least I'm honest. Yeah. My current Old Testament professor, Brent Strong, He wrote a book called The Old Testament is Dying, and it's this really interesting look on the importance of reading the Old Testament and what it means in a modern theological context. And he's drawn a lot of what we're doing in that class from that book. So I think he has some interesting ideas. So he's someone that, and he's a pretty humorous guy, and he writes in a pretty plain manner. So he's still an academic, but he writes in a pretty plain manner. So if you're thinking, something that's maybe not a giant of the industry, so to speak, but he's got some interesting thoughts. Another person that I like on modern theology and is is Gustavo Gutierrez. He is kind of the founder of liberation theology, which is a Central American and Latin American theological movement. He's actually himself from Peru. But
it's also an American, like the United States American movement, but it gets separated for some reason.
Yeah, and it comes into the United States, and it also branches out into Black liberation theology, which is a little bit of a different thing.
James Cone.
Yeah, I was going to say, and James Cone is another one I recommend. James Cone is kind of one of the main voices of Black liberation theology, and kind of the father of liberation theology in its first forms is Gustavo Gutierrez. In his book, and I think it's in its 15th or 16th edition now, but his book, A Theology of Liberation, is still considered to be one of the cornerstones of that movement. And it's a very prominent American theological movement. It's growing among non-Protestants, or non-Catholics, and Protestants, liberation theology as a whole. Black liberation theology is very central to a lot of Black churches, is my understanding as well. So James Cone is a great one. Crossing the Lynching Tree is a terrifying, beautiful, heartbreaking book about America and slavery and the theology of it all. And that one, if you ever read Black liberation theology, it was one of his last books that he wrote before his passing a few years ago. That one gets quoted a lot. So he's a good one too. Trying to think if there's anyone else to kind of, because I want to give a wide smattering.
Yeah, I had one. Sorry to interrupt, Andrew. No, C.S. Lewis comes to mind when you look at kind of like a brilliant theologian. A lot of his books are like the Screwtape Letters, and even if you look at like some of his other books too, like Narnia. I mean, there's a lot of like theology based into those books that are like basic books though.
Well, I'm going to call you guys out because the question was for podcast and YouTubes. So you gave a lot of great recommendations.
Yeah,
I would like to plug the Heretics podcast, Holy Heretics podcast. They talk a lot about what it means to come from a conservative Christian, especially evangelical setting, and what it means to deconstruct and reconstruct faith around, various, teachings that are sort of a cornerstone of more conservative brands of Christianity. And, how people look at them either from wherever they end up in Christianity or wherever they end up outside of Christianity. And just how sometimes even when you, intellectually reject a belief system, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily gone and not something you don't still think about. So that's my little plug for there. And I'll give you one more shot, and then we want to do our final question as we tap dance out the door.
Yeah, sorry, I totally started with like Robert Barron, and then I just went off track into like my theological readings. But a couple other people whose things are good to look into. Father Mike Schmidt is a Catholic theologian. He has an interesting podcast, The Bible in a Year. He also does a lot of videos on Catholic theology. So he's a good source. I also like the Bible Project. It's based out of Portland, Oregon, which Jacob and I are familiar with, having grown up not too far from there. But they do kind of, and it's a Protestant primarily, so you're going to get more of a Protestant perspective on the Bible. But it has, which is not bad. That's just to let you know. It's a more Protestant, almost evangelical sort of slant, which can be good in some ways. So, they do kind of all the books of the Bible. They have YouTube videos. I think they also have a podcast now. So, and they're really cool, really knowledgeable guys who run that. So that's another one that I like to recommend.
I have a simple recommendation. I mean, he is non-Catholic, but it's Pastor Addison. He really gets down to the depth of things and theology and getting down into the Bible and kind of making it be able to understand for like the normal person that just goes to church.
Are we ready to move on to our final question here?
Yeah.
All right. So the issue at hand is papal authority, or maybe more, papal politics. So I believe, I'm pretty sure I've been alive for Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis. And looking at those three popes as a Protestant, it's been incredible to see how differently they've been treated. That Pope John Paul seemed to be almost universally loved. And, the other two, I feel like Benedict received more of a lukewarm reception, maybe because, he was sort of a transitionary figure. But Pope Francis is highly divisive, at least as far as I can tell. And I'm surprised how many Catholics are comfortable coming out swinging against the Pope. It seems like a Protestant move. So it's a little surprising. What does that look like from inside the house? What is it like for Catholics as, there's been just differing attitudes to the different popes over time?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because John Paul II was Pope for 26 years, and a little over 26 years. And so he became Pope in, 1978. So, and he died in 2005. So that was a cataclysmic shift, not only in the Catholic Church happened over that period, but just in the world and the way we view figures of authority. So I think part of it is simply a matter of Catholics are more comfortable criticizing the Pope. I think in 1978, it would be almost unheard of to criticize the Pope because he was the Pope. In the same way that,
like I said, it seems like a Protestant thing. It's surprising to see people so.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's similar to, if you look at a figure like John F. Kennedy as president, he was not the most faithful to his wife, but like no one talked about that. It was kind of, there was a certain, he's the president, so we can't criticize certain aspects or certain things. Whereas now, obviously, people have no issue with criticizing anything about any political candidate. So I think part of it is a societal shift where we feel more comfortable criticizing authority figures. However, I think at the end of the day, the Pope as the vicar of Christ, I can't think of any of those. The chair of St. Peter, the successor of St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome. I think that he holds a certain precedence, at least doctrinally. So, he's considered to be the first among equal brother bishops. So, there's a certain level of at least theological power that he has. But yeah, I think it's true. I also think that the portions of the population being willing to criticize the Pope have changed as well. John Paul II was a more traditional conservative Pope. Benedict as well was on the more traditional conservative end. Pope Francis has a much, and by conservative I mean theologically conservative, not like an American Democrat Republican sort of thing. Whereas Pope Francis has a more liberal theology and and it's a different theology, a less traditional theology. So I think that the parts of the church.
Is it fair to say that Pope Francis is implemented by liberation theology, or is that a misunderstanding?
That's actually very true. Yeah. And there are liberation theology, when it first came about, was very controversial, partly because, if you're talking about some of these topics about care for the poor, and some of these things that it talks about that are good Christian values, but you're also doing it in a country where communism is currently a thing, there was a lot of conflation of the two. So the church was very wary to accept it. But under Francis, there's been a much wider acceptance of liberation theology. The Jesuits, and he's a Jesuit priest, have a very wide acceptance of liberation theology. So I think both being a Jesuit and being a Latin American bishop, he was very influenced by it. And you can see it in his care for the earth and his care for the poor, and the way in which he talks about certain people. I remember not too long after becoming Pope, he talked about how some of the people that he was most inspired by back home in Buenos Aires were essentially the trash collectors, and how it's important to take care of even the people, the trash collectors, even though they're not some important politician or whatever.
Especially trash collectors. I don't want to live in a city without trash collectors. That's a bad situation.
He used it as an example of saying, everyone has their place and everyone has their role, and they're dignified, and everyone should have a certain level of equal footing in the church. So, and that's a very liberation theology. Gustavo Gutierrez, in his book, one of the things he talks about is, if we're supposed to minister to the poor and marginalized, or who is that today? And it's the marginalized person who's being kind of pushed aside, and in many cases also oppressed by systems currently in place. And so you can see some echoes of that in Pope Francis and the types of people he chooses to focus on. When he goes as Pope and visits prisons or visits homeless shelters. And I think in some ways, that shocks people. I think he has a more low church. To go back to the low church, high church thing. I mean, the Pope, it's always high church, but it's a less formal, so it's a little bit lower church than some of the stuff that John Paul and Benedict were doing. And I think that for some people, that too leads to criticism. So I think there's a certain level of, he's still the Pope, unless you're a Sede Vaticanist or you're part of the Society of, Pope Pius XII, I think, which seceded from the church, because they basically believe everything after the Second Vatican Council is invalid. As long as you're not one of those people, there's still a certain level of the Pope is the Pope and has a certain authority. However, there are times you could go to Mass and you might have someone being like, we need to really pray for, in the prayers, be like, we really need to pray for the Pope because he's not being a good Pope, which would have never happened.
Wow.
In the past. Yeah, I was actually reading an interesting article earlier today about the divisions between Latin Mass Catholics.
Is Francis more tolerant, or is it just that, preachers or priests weren't, like you said before, weren't willing to go there in that time?
I think priests are more comfortable now with doing that. I also think there's been since the Second Vatican Council, and I think it's really grown in the last couple decades, a fissure in the church between the more traditional, who tend to view the Latin Mass as their primary Mass, and the more moderate and liberal, who do the new vernacular Mass or the Novus Ordo Mass, anyway, which is like the Mass in your own language, in terms of liturgy. And I think sometimes for a lot of people, how you celebrate on Sunday matters. And I think that a change in that, really affects people. We're dealing with one of the most personal things to you, which is your relationship with God and your eternal salvation and how you live that out. So I think as society has become more comfortable with saying, criticizing power, I think people have become more comfortable with criticizing the Pope. But at the end of the day, he still has authority over certain things. Like, when the Pope in Fratelli Tutti a couple years ago in his encyclical proclaimed that in our modern day and age of the nation state, there is no situation in which capital punishment is permissible, that rocked some boats. But it is still the job of the bishop to advocate that, at least on the outside, even if they have issues with that on the inside, because papal authority has been handed down. So.
Thanks for sharing that. I didn't know about that. I see a couple people with their hands up, and I'm just going to say sorry. We're over time. I apologize. I also have to apologize because I did lose track of one comment in questions. One question in comments. Woo, see, we go over an hour 15. My brain starts getting mushy. The question is, what are your thoughts on the theology of Meister Eckhart, especially as it relates to his conception of the distinction between Godhead and God? I am not familiar with this. I feel like I should recognize the name Eckhart. Andrew or Jacob, are you familiar with this?
I do recognize the name. However, I unfortunately must admit, I am not versed enough in his theology to feel like I can give any sort of thing that doesn't sound like me making stuff up. So I apologize to the question asker, but I don't feel comfortable or able to properly answer that. Always respect the honesty. What about you, Jacob?
I am just not familiar with the individual.
Well, we have been stumped. Congratulations. You stumped us. If you want to drop a link for that person in the comments, then we will all be smarter than we were before you asked. We are over time by about 10 minutes. Andrew, thank you for answering our questions. Are there any projects you want to plug or any final thoughts you want to share with us as we close up shop here?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun. I will say that Jake and I sort of host a podcast together when I have time to edit it. It's a history and religion podcast called Podding Through Religion. So if you're interested in hearing more of what I have to say, I guess you can go check that out. It's on most streaming services. But yeah, otherwise, thanks for having me. I enjoy being a part of this community. So it's been fun to be able to give my 2 cents here today.
I think we're talking about the Bhagavad Gita soon on there. So.
Yes. And we just recorded our 1-year anniversary where Jacob and I just kind of randomly talk about stuff. So that should come out soon. And there's 4 or 5 episodes out right now. So yeah.
Wow, I didn't know Jacob had another full podcast. You're a busy guy, Jacob.
Yeah, I do a lot. I'm involved in quite a bit.
Well, and we appreciate you sharing your time and your skills with us. If we've covered everything else, I'm gonna read our exit script here. And I want to thank Andrew for answering all our questions, and thanks for being here, Jacob. I know you got all sorts of things on your time. We're not even your only podcast. This has been the Dank Christian Memes podcast. Our music is provided by Olive Tiger. Our next recording session will be Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Our Dank Christian Memes is a place for all kinds of Christians and all kinds of non-Christians to enjoy silly memes together, and also this podcast. If you would like to connect with our community further, there's a link to our Discord in our comments section. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may the memes bless you and keep you.